Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. I am Vrinda Sahai, Research Analyst in the Security Studies program at Carnegie India. The India-EU Free Trade Agreement is shaping up to be one of the most consequential trade negotiations, both economically and strategically. For decades, trade negotiations between the two moved slowly, often constrained by regulatory differences, domestic sensitivities, and differing expectations around market access and standards. Yet, at present, both sides are more willing to move toward a comprehensive agreement, which speak to an evolving strategic relationship between the two large democratic economies, their role in shaping global trade rules, and their effort to navigate a more fragmented international economic order. Joining us today for this discussion is Mr. Nicolas Suzuki. Mr. Suzuki is an advisor for trade and economic security at the Jacques Delors Institute. His work is at the intersection of trade policy and economic diplomacy, with a particular focus on European economic security agenda, EU-China and EU-India relations, EU-CPTPP cooperation, WTO reform, and digital trade. He also leads the trade policy consultancy, International Trade Intelligence. Mr. Suzuki, welcome to Interpreting India.
Hi, Vrinda. Pleasure to be on.
Great. So I want to begin with a basic understanding of how this free trade agreement between EU and India has come to be. Both sides, the EU and India, have both been sort of cautious when it comes to trade liberalization in the past, specifically about trade negotiations with different countries in the past. What are the factors you would say had sort of led to a renewed momentum for trade agreements on either side?
Yeah, so I've been working on EU-India trade for the better part of a decade now. And for most of the time, the honest answer to when will this deal happen was probably never. The negotiations started all the way back in 2007, then and then they were for the best part of a decade in what I would call a zombie state. So they were technically alive, but they were really not doing much of anything. What changed is that the world changed around both of them. And I think also faster than either had anticipated. And I think you need to understand three forces that converged almost simultaneously. The first and most obvious one is Trump. So the US slapped tariffs of up to 50% in Indian exports in mid-2025, 25% reciprocal, 25% for Russian oil purchases. The EU also got hit with 15% baseline tariffs even after a deal. They had a dispute with over Greenland, of course. Suddenly, both sides found themselves at the receiving end of American aggression, and political incentive was to show the world that you have other friends. So that became somewhat overwhelming. There's also a quote from U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent. He complained that they put 25% tariffs on India for buying Russian oil. And what happened next? The Europeans signed a trade deal with India. So I think that tells you that the signal was received exactly as it was intended. So the second force is China. And this one runs deeper than the Trump factor. So for the EU, the exposure to China is structural, rare earths, clean technologies, battery components, pharmaceuticals. So this whole de-risking agenda that has been going on for a couple of years is not really just theoretical. We have a number of different legislations like the Critical Raw Materials Act, the CHIPS Act, the Net Zero Industry Act. And India can offer something that no other partner of a comparable scale can. A very large English-speaking economy with a young workforce and strong ambitions for manufacturing. So it can't be a replacement for China, and nobody in Brussels seriously thinks that, but it can be a credible new outside option. And for India, the calculation is similar, but in reverse. China also accounts for a lot of India's electronic imports. Delhi has been trying to reduce that dependency for years. And of course, India wants to take some of the slice of the global manufacturing output that China had in the past. And the third force, which I think is getting a little bit less attention, but was arguably quite decisive for the timing, is also the EU's phasing down of the GSP preferences that India would get. So from the beginning of January of this year, India lost preferential treatment for almost all of its exports to the EU. And this is very significant. So Indian exporters would face the full European MFN tariff. And at the same time, Bangladesh and Vietnam could get duty-free access, which they actually have been able to get for many, many years now already. So India has very ambitious targets for increasing manufacturing capacity, especially for textiles. And without this agreement, these targets would have basically been dead on arrival. So this withdrawal of the GSP scheme on the European side, this phasing out, was also a ticking clock that was really concentrating, I think, a lot of people on the Indian side, in a way, maybe all of the diplomatic objectives never really did. And maybe one more thing that you could also add on the Indian side, India wanted to be first part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. India left that agreement in 2019, I believe, because of China. Instead, India then went on a spree to sign all kinds of bilateral agreements since then. It's the UAE, with Australia, with EFTA, and then the UK. All in all, more than 9 different deals in the last 4 years. So that's undermining this old stereotype that India is impossible to negotiate with. Now, arguably, a lot of these deals were very shallow. Yeah, we have to be clear about that. But at the same time, each of these agreements was successively deeper than the previous ones. So the Modi government clearly decided that there was a geopolitical momentum. There was a moment that demanded that they needed to have a different approach to trade. And the EU in this whole chain was the biggest prize still available, because whatever agreement there may at some point be with the US, it's also going to have to carve out a lot of different issues because of US agricultural interests. Yeah, so I think this is where it gets interesting, because this agreement is at the same time the most ambitious thing that India has ever done. But by European standards, it is actually quite incomplete. So there's somewhere meeting in the middle there, right? So let me start on the Indian side. So we've just talked about these different agreements that India has struck since 2022, each agreement being deeper than the last one. But with Australia, for example, India didn't really include services much. It excluded most sensitive goods. With the UAE, on the other hand, it went a little bit further, but it kept automobiles out. With the UK, it included automobiles, but it was restricted to a very low quota of 37,000 cars. So with the EU, we really have a much wider ranging agreement now with tariff elimination on 96.6% of EU good exports by value. For cars, you still have a quota, but it's a much higher quota of 250,000 cars at 10% duty that will slowly be phased in. You have wine duties dropping very significantly also over time from 150% to 20 to 30%, and spirits that are also coming down from to about 40%. over a period of 7 years. That's shorter than the UK, notably, which I think European negotiators will be keen to point out. So if we look at maybe another sector like services, the EU got a lot of different commitments across many different subsectors, which the European Commission claims is more than India has offered to any other partner in the past, including to the UK and to Australia and EFTA. India opened up financial services, telecoms, maritime services. These are all sectors that were essentially closed off to previous negotiations. So if we look more on the EU side, comparing this agreement to other EU agreements, it gets a little bit more complicated. If you line this up against, let's say, the EU-Mercosur agreement, the EU-New Zealand agreement, or the EU-Canada agreement, which are all relatively recent trade agreements that the EU has concluded. I think the clearest gap in the agreement with India is that there's no chapter on government procurement. And that's pretty big. So in India, the government public procurement market is worth roughly $600 billion a year, and the EU got nothing. The UK got a very limited commitment, but in the end, the Europeans decided that they would not pursue this chapter because they wanted to come to a conclusion. The second big gap compared to other agreements is the sustainability chapter. And I think this is also where this agreement will actually get most scrutiny during the ratification process. We can talk about that a bit more later. So the EU-New Zealand FTA, which I think most people in Brussels and the European Parliament would consider is the gold standard of an agreement with a sustainability chapter that the EU has so far concluded, has, for example, an enforceable mechanism for the Paris Agreement. For EU-Mercosur, for example, there's also compliance with the Paris Agreement as an essential element clause that can trigger a suspension. And for the EU-India deal, we see cooperation, dialogue, expert review, but there's no penalty mechanism. So India rejected the EU's specific model here. It was perceived as an instrument of regulatory leverage, as something that was a form of protectionism rather than an environmental concern. That's a way to sell it at home. The Commission on the other side now says in Brussels, yes, actually this deal is somewhat enforceable. The Indian said it isn't. So I think the devil will be very much in the details, but I think we will see that this is not really a fully enforceable sustainability agreement. So maybe the third difference to other EU agreements is about investment protection. This was nominally deferred and is still to be negotiated in a separate agreement. India, of course, terminated all of its bilateral investment treaties in 2016. So there's a certain gap for the European side, which likes to have these agreements in place for investor certainty. How much they actually matter in practice is a different question, but it is the approach that the EU has always used in the past. I think there are big question marks if we will ever see such an agreement now that the big negotiations have concluded. But nominally, there's now a negotiating track for this. So overall, on tariffs, on services, this is probably really the most ambitious deal that India has ever signed. On a lot of other issues, on procurement, on sustainability investment, it is quite different from the EU's practice. But I think there was a bet that was made in Brussels that you want to negotiate this and finish the negotiation now rather than in 10 years. You want to have maybe a somewhat more incomplete deal with the world's largest country, fast-growing economy, rather than holding out for that perfection. But of course, now we have to see whether the European Parliament agrees is still in valid.
So I think on the Indian side, there has just been a recurring concern that the EU regulations, once they mount up, they can become like a non-tariff barrier. To what extent would you say that holds true? And, how is the EU sort of responding to these concerns or even allegations to an extent about over-regulation?
This is a question where I have to be careful not to annoy both sides simultaneously, which in my experience probably means I'm going to get it about right. The Indian position is relatively straightforward, and I would say it's not entirely without foundation. The argument goes something like this. You give us a trade deal that cuts tariffs. Wonderful. Thank you very much. But what's the point of zero duty access if our rice then gets rejected at the border? Because your pesticide residue limit is 100 times stricter than the American one. So if our medical devices need $100,000 or 100,000 euro in registration fees for each product before they can enter the market, if our steel gets hit by carbon border tariff adjustment, that wipes out any advantages that we just negotiated. So in India, European regulations like this are often seen just as a form of hidden protectionism or regulatory imperialism. So now let me maybe take three of these big regulatory issues that figured in the negotiations in turn. So CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that's really the elephant in the room. Issue that Indian negotiators pushed hardest on and actually got the least. So India did not get an exemption from CBAM, none. India's blast furnace steel emits a lot more carbon emission than global average, I think 1.5 times or so. So Indian steel and aluminum exports are going to be very significantly affected, right? They have already fallen before the agreement was signed. And that's significant because they have been one of the fastest growing exports over the last couple of years. So what India did get instead was this MFN clause, which means that any flexibility that the EU would give, let's say to the US or to any other country on CBAM would also have to apply to India. There's also a technical dialogue on India's own carbon trading scheme, a financial commitment, a big package of 500 million euro for a green transition, which sounds generous until you learn that decarbonizing India's heavy industry requires something in the region of 390 billion euro. So the EU's contribution would be only a very, very, very tiny portion of that bill. So the EU really was standing the line on CBAM, and India did not get quite what it wanted, but it was willing to make a compromise. So maybe a second area is SBS standards, so sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And here I would say it's both quite technical, but also emotionally charged. So between 2020 and 2024, for example, the EU's food safety alert system flagged over 850 notifications related to Indian food products, like on sesame seeds, where the Indian exports or the EU imports from India exceeded the residue limits. And yet those residue limits are much, much below, for example, what the US and Canada would allow. So it's actually by an order of magnitude less. So the Indian exporters would then say, okay, these are limits that are so low that we can actually not really measure them very reliably with the testing equipment that we have. It makes it very difficult for us to be compliant. That concerns a lot of agricultural exports like basmati rice, spices, marine products. Importantly, that's a big one. So these are really high value Indian exports that have faced already intensified inspection regimes, regardless of what the tariff schedule now is saying, right? These are still going to be there. So what the FDA now does on SPS is useful, I would say, but it's not completely transforming it either. So it introduces some clear timelines for import approvals, which matters, of course, for something like a shrimp. If it sits too long at the border, you can't really import it anymore. But at the same time, Indian imports must still meet the EU rules without an exception. The EU is not going to lower its food safety standards for this trade agreement. So the honest answer to Indian complaints is that the EU still believes that its standards are proportionate, that they're non-discriminatory, and that there's a certain degree of convergence that needs to happen on India's side. And the third area is what I would call the general regulatory environment. So there you have product testing and conformity assessments, these kind of things. This I would say is a bit less drastic than CBAM or the food safety issue. But overall, it is still quite significant for Indian exporters, particularly for small firms. So the FDA has this chapter on good regulatory practices, where you need to have advanced notification of new regulations, of non-discriminatory stakeholder consultations, regulatory impact assessment. There's this working group on conformity assessment to address duplicative testing. These are all useful mechanisms. You can compare it to what the EU, for example, has with Japan, but they're also much less ambitious than of mutual recognition protocols that the EU has with other partners, like with Canada. So this big gap, I think, really shows that the EU and Indian regulatory systems are quite far apart, which should not really be surprising for anyone. I could maybe, let's maybe leave it at that.
Sure. No, I'd like to actually follow up on that and going off this discussion on regulation. And you mentioned the chapter on good regulatory practices. The chapter in itself talks about the development and implementation of regulations for goods and services. So I'd say that we've discussed the development part of it. We've understood why it's come into being. But on the implementation side, how would you say on a day-to-day basis, what would that mean once it comes into effect, and like how?
So it's these chapters that sound really boring, right? But they are the ones that actually determine what works in practice, whether a deal works. So a tariff schedule gets a headline, but these questions of regulatory cooperation determine a bit the outcome of how it works. So let me try to make this a bit more concrete. I mentioned this example before. You're an Indian pharmaceutical company. You want to export a generic medicine. You have a registration process that can take you several years and cost you hundreds of thousands of euro per product, right? It could involve these testing requirements that are maybe sometimes duplicate to what you already do in your home market. Or on the other side, you're maybe a European machinery manufacturer. You try to sell to India, and India introduces what is called a quality control order that changes the technical specifications for your product, different Indian standards that you have to apply for the Indian market. But you find out about these different standards only after they've been made. So you had no opportunity to comment, you had no transition period, and so on. So these are, again, the kinds of problems that a tariff cut can't really solve for you. A zero duty tariff is, at the end of the day, meaningless if you don't get regulatory approval. It's still a big, big barrier. So what these chapters on good regulatory practices do is that they impose these disciplines on process for both sides. So you have to have advanced public notification before either side introduces a new big regulation that could affect the trade. They have to publish the proposals. They have to allow the stakeholders from the other side included. That's important, yeah, to comment in an early stage. And second, you need to have this process with regulatory impact assessments. Both sides have to be able to analyze whether these measures that are proposed are actually necessary, if there's some kind of alternatives that could be put in place that are maybe less trade restricting, and so on. So, and the third part is about consultation. So Indian companies, for example, will get the same right to participate in European consultation processes on new regulations. The same rights as European companies do. But the same is true for European companies in India. So none of this is really exactly revolutionary. But if you've seen what the Indian Bureau of the Bureau of Indian Standards has done in the last couple of years, you will actually find that European firms have cared about this actually quite deeply. So it could matter potentially in the future.
Okay, we could probably go on endlessly about regulation itself, but I do want to move on from that.
It's maybe also a little bit boring for your listeners.
Maybe, but if they're interested, we'll love to talk more about that in another episode. Okay, so I want to touch upon the fact that one of India's competitive advantages lies in services sectors. So if we look at this agreement, how significant are the mobility provisions for Indians under this FTA? And what does that mean going forward? Is there a major change? No? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is the question that actually nearly killed the original negotiations back between 2007 and 2013. I wrote about this quite extensively a couple of years ago. There was a whole saga about the negotiations in the late 2000s where India wanted 50,000 visas a year, 20,000 of those for the UK, because the UK at that point, of course, was still a member of the EU. David Cameron's government at the time practically had a collective seizure because they had promised to cut net migration to less than 22,000. So something didn't quite work there with those numbers. The UK Home Office then introduced a minimum salary requirement and fees for non-EU workers, which had a big impact on the negotiations for the services chapter. And I would say really contributed to the suspension of the talks in 2013. This was one of the really sticking issues at the time, maybe even more than cars or dairy. So what Indian negotiators, or what in trade jargon you call Mode 4, the temporary movement of professionals. This was really one of the issues that broke the camel's back then. So what changed between 2013 and 2026? I would say that this camel apparently went to the chiropractor. The UK is no longer in the room, of course. So that's a big one. It complicated things in the past. But also Europe's labor market has shifted very significantly over the last decade. Germany has 700,000 unfulfilled IT positions. The EU's demographic trajectory is, to put it mildly, not on a good track. And at the same time, in the US, you see that there's more and more difficulty for skilled migration. You've seen the big visa fees that were proposed on H-1B visas. It all becomes very unpredictable, right? There are longer processing times. There's a general hostility even to skilled migration from the Trump administration. So Europe suddenly looks like it is maybe a path of lesser resistance if you're an Indian tech talent. So while the US is moving in the direction of making things more restrictive, the EU is kind of going in the opposite direction for skilled migration. I have to emphasize that. So in terms of the overall negotiations that we saw that what they made different than previously is that they separated the question of mobility, of labor mobility, from the trade negotiations and from the trade agreement. They separated it from the trade agreement. So on the one hand, that helps with ratification now, because you don't have to get the approval from far-right parties for the trade agreement text itself to go through the European Parliament, where, as I was mentioning, the sustainability issues will already get a lot of scrutiny. So if the left doesn't agree and the right doesn't agree, then maybe you're going to get really squeezed. So at least on the side of the far-right parties, they have brought it up already in some discussions in the European Parliament. But since this is a separate agreement, it will probably not hold up the ratification. And secondly, it kind of also acknowledges that migration policy is not really a competence for the EU. So the EU can negotiate trade. That's an exclusive competence, a very powerful competence for the European Commission. But the EU cannot tell France or Germany how many Indian professionals it will admit. But what it can do is to work together with the member states to create this framework that we now have, where certain willing member states can act. So what they created is this comprehensive framework of cooperation on mobility. It's separate from the FTA, but it was announced on the same day. This framework creates this template for member states for fast-tracking work permits, especially for study, for research, for seasonal work, for up to 12 months. It also establishes a coordination mechanism in the form of this EU Legal Gateway Office in New Delhi, which is supposed to open later this year and be a one-stop shop where Indians interested to go to the EU can go to find out about opportunities. So there are also some social security arrangements, some talent pools for IT professionals, and so on. I think on the Indian side, we saw that this was perceived as somewhat positive, right? NASSCOM came out with some statements talking about this agreement as being a big boost for the tech services sector, that can diversify the market. Indian IT services exports to the EU are already at about $20 billion US. So the EU is really already one of the largest destinations. I think the second biggest destination even after the US. But the potential growth is even bigger if these barriers come down. So there's been some studies. One study from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy projects that Indian IT service exports could grow by another $10 billion, so 50% more in the next couple of years. So that could be a very meaningful buffer on the Indian side as the US visa regime tightens. Yeah, so if fully implemented, doing a lot of work in that question. So
let's just assume the best case scenario is we take it as it is and go forward.
Of course. So in EU trade agreements, and that's probably true for most trade agreements, also for other countries, We have seen this in a number of cases now. They're fully negotiated. They're partially ratified, but then incompletely implemented. So, but for the sake of argument, let's say that both sides really follow through in full implementation, right? So what does it look like in let's say, 2031, or in 2036? So I want to go back to these numbers from the Kiel Institute. I think they do some of the best projections in that space. It's obviously always based on a lot of assumptions, right? But according to these projections from the Kiel Institute, they have said that the bilateral trade volumes could go up 51 to 65% for EU goods exports to India. And that would mean roughly doubling to 97 billion in just the next 5 years. So EU chemicals exports, for example, could rise by almost 12 billion. That's very significant. Indian textile exports to the EU, currently around $7 billion, could get to 30 to 40 billion dollars. That is according to Minister Goyal, so I would take those numbers a little bit more with a pinch of salt. But the direction is of course plausible, right? Because Indian exports will become a lot more competitive vis-a-vis Bangladesh and Vietnam. So these trade volume numbers, they're very useful for press releases, but I think this is really not how we should measure success in the next couple of years. I think the really more interesting measures are structural, about the integration of the European and the Indian economy. For example, supply chain integration. So success, from my perspective, in 5 to 10 years would mean that European pharmaceutical companies would manufacture more active ingredients in India rather than sourcing them from China. Right now, the EU imports a lot of pharmaceutical products from India, but the active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. They go from China to India and then to the EU. So it would mean that Indian pharmaceutical firms and chemical firms would become tier one suppliers into European industrial value chains. That would be a big success, right? For me, it would be a big success if the Clean Energy Partnership would produce some tangible results. If European electronics companies build production capacity in India as a China plus one strategy, and not just moving some final assembly for the Indian market into India. So if we go back to these projections from the Kiel Institute, they estimate that while the Indian exports rise, that Chinese exports would be also concurrently falling 5 to 10% as a result of the FTA. So that's a process that economists like to call trade diversion. It means that there's a reorganization of supply chains happening. And for me, I think that's probably the really most important metric to see whether there's a strategic logic to this agreement, and whether we can see this in 5 to 10 years would tell me whether the underlying motivation for it has been vindicated.
Right. Thanks for playing into the 100% implementation scenario with me. But practically, we know that there are bound to be certain hurdles, certain friction points when it gets to either acceptance of the agreement or going forward in the implementation. So where do you see those hurdles, in what particular sectors or areas or chapters, as we spoke about regulation before? Where do you see there will be the major points of hurdles regarding this implementation?
Yeah, I think there are certainly several friction points. I mean, we already briefly talked about the issues with ratification, right? But if we think about it, about specific sectors and specific issues, we can think about automobiles, for example. So right when the deal was announced, you saw that the share prices of Indian automakers were dropping in price between 1% to 4%. So I think markets understood that there are certain implications of this for Indian car makers. So you have this 250,000 vehicle quota at 10% duty that is slowly being phased in over a long period of time, right? And it's only for certain cars up from a certain value. But it's a significant competitive shock for SUVs that are purely made in India, which is where some of the margins have been made. Right, European luxury brands currently sell about 49,000 cars. That's in a market of more than 4 million cars. So for them, there's a lot of headroom for growth, even within that quota that we have. But I think we can also see that there's potential friction, right? You have the Japanese and the Korean manufacturers who've built factories in India. They've invested very heavily there over years. They will lobby very ferociously, not against the tariff reductions and quotas, because those are a done deal. But probably behind the scene, you will see that there will be some kind of friction. They have invested into a protected market. I think they still have some influence with the Indian government on some of these policies. So if the backlash from them is severe enough, I wouldn't rule out that India can still find some creative administrative ways to slow implementation through some non-tariff measures, homologation requirements, safety testing, these kinds of things. So I think that could be a potential point of friction, because also from the European side, cars were so important as a point of market access. The second point, I think, is really CBAM, right? I've already talked about this before, so I'll be brief. The charges for CBAM, they will increase over time. So CBAM will expand to cover more and more downstream products. So not just steel and aluminum, but things that are produced with steel and aluminum. So every year, Indian exporters will have a very concrete figure that they can point to as the EU giving one hand and taking with another. The transition package that I talked about, these 500 millions, they will have been spent quite quickly. The technical dialogue on recognizing India's carbon trading scheme will be ongoing, but these processes will take a lot longer than anyone expects. For India to really have its own emissions trading scheme that Europe would consider equivalent. And some Indian politicians, and probably several, when there's election time, will stand up in the Lok Sabha and say, look, CBAM really shows that EU was never serious about an equitable partnership. They tricked us. For me, the question whether that kind of narrative holds really depends on whether the EU can show that there has been some tangible progress on cooperating on CBAM before that kind of political patience runs out. So the EU really has to put its money where its mouth is, which it has done with this €500 million package, but now it really has to get implemented, and we really have to see where things go. But it can't just be a hollow process. Otherwise, we will see that. The third point of friction, I think, relates is somewhat similar. It's this sustainability chapter, especially in the next couple of months for the ratification process. On the EU side, you will have MEPs from certain groups, environmental NGOs, who will scrutinize the implementation of the trade and sustainable development provisions with a lot of zeal. There's no doubt about that. Some of them will have conflicting feelings because they feel strongly that India should be a de-risking partner, but at the same time, they also feel very strongly about having some enforcement mechanism with sanctions. The whole point about complying with the Paris Agreement and so on. If India's carbon emissions continue to rise, as they do quite dramatically right now, the European Parliament will face pressure to condition the ratifications or have stronger commitments. But I think they don't quite have the majorities in the next months, so that it can really be a stumbling block. But we'll probably see that it will be a contentious discussion, at least. Okay, so another point that maybe hasn't gotten quite so much attention, but that could also be quite structurally damaging, given the growth of services trade between the two, is the question of data adequacy. So, so India has not received a data adequacy decision under the EU's data privacy rules, GDPR. And quite frankly, it's also not anywhere close to get them. India's Digital Personal Data Protection Act, which has just been ratified a couple of years ago, has very broad exemptions for government access, a government-controlled data protection board. And these are really structural obstacles to adequacy under EU standards. What does that mean? So without that adequacy decision, every Indian IT company that will process European personal data has to rely on what is called a standard contractual clause. And these standard contractual clauses add cost, they add complexity, they add legal uncertainty. And this matters because services are where India's competitive advantage really lies. And data flows between the two regions are really the backbone of modern services trade. So you can negotiate very liberal mode 4 commitments and have these mobility arrangements, as we have seen. But if Indian companies can't move European data efficiently, I would say that the services chapter is operating with one arm tied behind its back. And the FDA just can't resolve this. That's a reality. It's on a separate legal track, under a separate DG Justice. But I think it will become an increasingly visible irritant as service trade continues to grow or even accelerates in growth with the FDA. And maybe another related point is specifically this question of mobility, right? The implementation of it. So as I said before, the mobility framework only applies to member states that are willing, and immigration policy remains a national competence of the member states. And we are currently in a period in European politics where anti-immigration sentiment is vote winning for far-right parties and for even center-right parties. Many EU governments now are run either by the far-right or have coalition partners whose entire political identity is built on restricting migration. And yes, this is about mobility, not migration, right? That's what the Commission will tell you. But I mean, that's a fine detail, right, in these discussions. So asking governments to issue fast-track work permits for Indian IT professionals, even highly skilled ones, even in sectors with acute labor shortages, is asking these kinds of governments, the far-right governments, to take a political risk that many of them will not want to take. So there's a gap between what Brussels signs, what Vienna or Rome are implementing, and that gap could be very substantial. It could be growing. And every Indian IT professional who gets stuck in a visa queue, despite the promises of what was now agreed will say this is evidence that Europe doesn't keep its word. Right. So managing expectations, being honest what these frameworks can and cannot deliver in the near or medium term is probably one of the most delicate political exercises of this implementation process now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saluki, for joining us today, sharing your expertise and speaking to the content and nature of the agreement in particular. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you to our listeners. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening and see you next time.
Thank you for having me.